So honestly, I was talking about this yesterday, and Dora, with her amazing slides, reminded me again about the conversation I was having. We're here at an amazing performance conference, Perf Now, and I was saying to someone yesterday that I don't think, like, show of hands if it's your first time here. Okay, it's a bunch of you guys. Thank you for coming and welcome. I just want to mention how important it was that A, you're here, and B, we are actually joined today by a lot of people who have done amazing work in performance previously, but also paved the way for this conference to happen. A lot of them are actually the authors of the Dora's slide with all the books. And a lot of them are here, you know. And I just want to make sure I don't forget, because I went through all those books. I actually owned them all as well. And I want to make sure I mention this. You know, one of the earliest, or two of the earliest books that really paved the way for this conference to happen were written by Steve Souders, who's here, by the way. A big shout out to Steve. A big deal. Also, you know, many books under his belt, but one that was on the screen, Performance Daybook by Stoyan. Where's Stoyan? He's at the bar? Is that it? I mean, Stoyan's here. He spoke yesterday, you know. One of the books that was posted was from A Book Apart, written by Scott Gell, who's in the building. Shout out, Scott. Okay. One of the books was also High Performance Images. One of the co-authors, Tim Cadlett's in the building. Shout outs, Tim. I mean, I'm sorry about the plug, but one of the books that was written... Oh, wait. Oh, I almost forgot that one. Also, we have an author, Jeremy Wagner's in the building. He wrote a book. All right. He's actually here. He's at the Performance Help Desk. Pardon me? Oh, he had a few, you know, but that one wasn't on, but thank you. And of course, I mean, I hate to plug myself, but a book called Using Web Page Tests was written, and one of the authors, Rick Viscomi. Where are you at, Rick? I know he's been working hard. Apparently hardly working. But shout out to Rick, so let's give him a little, you know. And one of the co-authors wasn't Patrick Meenan. I remember that email. I was like so embarrassed. I was like, hey dude, amazing book. I wasn't the author. I was like, oh, okay. But one of them was our next speaker. So here to join us in an amazing conversation, I'm sure, about third parties is Andy Davies.
Thank you, Henri. One of the things you should know about writing a book for Web Page Test is you'd write blog posts about other things, and Pat Meenan would send you a DM saying, shouldn't you be writing a book documenting my work? So I currently work for SpeakCurve. I'm a consultant. I've spent over 10 years doing web performance. Makes me sound very old. And today, I'm going to talk about third-party tags. And I'm going to give you my experience. I'm going to give you my opinions and things I've learnt based on that experience. And I might be a touch controversial. I will hopefully also give you some things to take away that you may find useful on a day-to-day basis. But question for you all, who loves third-party tags? Oh, one brave person puts up the hand. Yes, they're one of those things as web performance people we love to hate. And I'm hoping to change your view on that slightly. One of the things that we have to be aware with third-party tags is they compete for the network. Third-party tags have a bunch of downsides. One of them is they compete for the network. This is a chart from web page test. It is the connection view chart, which is below the waterfall, for edition.cnn.com. And one of the things you'll notice is you can see when there are bytes are being downloaded over the wire. And perhaps if I, oh, it's gone. Zoom in and just pick a segment. And if you look at the top connection and then the two below it, you can actually see where there's a space in the top connection where there are no bytes are being downloaded because the other connections coming from the third parties have stolen the bandwidth, in essence. So they compete for the network, and they steal the bandwidth we care about. If you want to get to see this, you can't see this in Chrome DevTools or any of the other browser dev tools because they choose to shape on a single request basis. So you have to use something like SpeedCurve or Web Page Test or Debug Bear that uses DummyNet to shape the network. The thing they also do is they make us wait for new connections. If request number 3 here, which is some JavaScript, is a piece of render blocking JavaScript in the head, that page will not render until that connection has been made and the JavaScript is downloaded. You can also see where there's contention in the bottom row where the purple TLS bar gets really, really wide because the certificate exchange is caught up, competing for its place on the network. They fight for the main thread. Third-party tags are predominantly JavaScript, and lots of it. We'll come back to this story later, because this is some shots from a timeline I took of a client I worked with about a year and a half ago, where they actually hired me in to profile third-party JavaScript for 3 weeks. It was fun. So, despite all their problems, we have to remember they provide things that we aren't necessarily going to build ourselves. You know, some sophisticated teams, like the Love Holidays people, the Etsy people, the FT, may build their own experimentation platforms based around feature flags. But not everybody's going to do that. There's other things that are tremendously hard to do on your own. Setting up your own advertising network is beyond the scope of most sites. So, as much as they have drawbacks, they also provide some great features. And our challenge is how do we balance those drawbacks and their challenges with the benefits they bring to us. And where I start is with Simon Hearn's request map. And I make a map of what's actually on the page. This is an e-commerce site. The blue circle in the middle is the actual e-commerce site. The pinkish purple, magenta, let's call it magenta. Circle about 1 o'clock just above it is actually Qubit SmartServe, which is a pig of a thing from a third-party performance. Some of the purple dots further out are GTM, but we get to get a nice picture. And then what I do with this is start asking key questions. And because when I'm brought in as a consultant, I've normally got somebody reasonably high up paying my bill. Harry probably has the same experience. We generally get people who care paying our bill, which means we have some power and some influence. And the key question is, are we still paying for it? Does anybody still use it? If you're within the EU, you should know the answers to these questions because you have to know them for GDPR compliance. You have to know what is on your page, what data it's collecting, and what it does with that data to be compliant with GDPR. Are there duplicates? It's quite common to see lots and lots of duplicates on a page. For static content, can we replace it with our own self-hosted version? Harry talked a bit about this morning. And then we talk about, I tend to think about what influence does the tag have on the visitor's experience? When should we load it? And where should we execute it? And those are sorts of the 3 questions I'm going to explore today. I showed you an e-commerce site. The other challenge is some of these questions are really not easy for ad-funded sites. This is a newspaper. And as you can see, they have lots of third parties. And newspapers are in a really hard place. On one hand, social media and search have stolen their eyeballs. People see a story, they click on it, they read it, they leave. On the other hand, they're funded generally by advertising. And advertisers may spend this much to get their slot, but the publisher ends up with about this much. Lots of revenue disappears within the ad ecosystem, so publishers are in a really hard place. But the way I like to think about it, we talk about page load, and we are going to be talking about page load quite a lot here because that's where one of the places third parties have the most influence. If page load is a journey where we go from hinting to the visitor, is the browser doing something? Is the page useful? Is it usable? Can I interact with it? And the question is, where do our third parties fit into that model? And all too often, what I see is somebody bungs all the third parties in GTM or Adobe Target or their tag manager, and as soon as the tag manager loads, all the third parties get thrown onto the page. I would like you to think about moving away from that model. The big thing to remember, as it's like coming back to Katie's talks about early metrics having a bigger impact later in the waterfall, is the tags we're loading early in the page, particularly in the head, have a critical impact. You know, some of them are render blocking, particularly if it uses render blocking CSS or JavaScript. But even when they're not render blocking, they're still going to execute. And when they start to execute, they're occupying the main thread. Sometimes you get really weird things like you can have a piece of JavaScript occupying the main thread that will prevent or delay rendering of your LCP image. You might have half your LCP image on the screen. It's the weirdest thing when you see it. So you should watch out for render blocking third-party scripts, or style sheets in this case. Every style sheet blocks the rendering of content after it, because those styles may change how it looks. Every blocking tag that is without async or defer attributes stops the HTML parser from from parsing what's after it. So we have a really bad habit in web performance of focusing on what happens when those fail, when their CDN's not available. And it's probably about 10 years since I first did this on stage. And we have to wait for the TCP connection to time out before it actually displays anything. And we don't have another 30 seconds to watch for that, so I'm quitting that. The more interesting question to me is what's the impact of creating those new connections for that render blocking content when it succeeds. And here I did an example. It's a crappy test page I use for demos. But I used self-hosted fonts, and I used Google fonts. And I chose Google fonts because they're common, but I also chose them because they're fast. But even a fast render blocking resource like Google Fonts still affects the rendering of this page by 1/10 of a second. That may change if there are other render blocking resources in the head. It also may get worse if there aren't. And pre-connect won't save us in this situation. If we put a pre-connect in the head of the page, it's not going to happen soon enough. Neither will early hints, because there's no server think time here. So the less server think time you've got, the less effective early hints are. But we might not be able to use it anyway, particularly in Europe, because pre-connect gives away the visitor's IP address. Visitor's IP address is personal data. And we cannot give personal data to a third party without having our visitor's permission. So we have some challenges. And for that reason, a lower German court found the use of Google fonts to be in breach of GDPR. And if Google fonts isn't considered legitimate, then probably none of our other static resources are considered legitimate without consent. Whether that's things we're loading from Unpackage or JS Deliver or Typekit, we probably can't load those until we've asked the visitor for consent. Harry's got an article about self-hosting static assets, because it's not just about consent. Self-hosting them is often good for performance too. I may have spent, Tammy's laughing, and Tammy's laughing because I may have spent a large chunk of the last month going through all the data we collect and how we protect it from a GDPR perspective, because some of our customers want to know it. So I know the law on this, but I'm not a lawyer. I'm also not a data protection officer. So you should go talk to yours. They would love to hear from you. So we've talked about consent and talked about needing consent before we load third parties. They're often referred to as cookie consent, but they're more than that. They come under the e-privacy directive and they come under GDPR. And some consent managers are faster than others. The top one is Quantcast, which is probably the most popular CMP, and I think the bottom one is Optanon. And what we can see, and this is the first view. This is a visitor who hasn't given consent. And what we can see is actually, to get the consent UI up, our poor visitors had to wait 5.5 seconds before they ask if they can consent. So not all consent managers are equal. So pick your consent manager carefully. This is one situation where I would actually consider using pre-connects, because the consent manager becomes vital to their experience, but I don't know what the data protection authorities would say about whether it's legitimate interest. So go talk to your data protection officer. I actually think consent managers are an ideal third party to move to edge compute. The CDN edge network knows what legal jurisdiction the visitor's in, so whether they have to be GDPR compliant, whether they have to be CCPA compliant, or whether you can just serve them third parties and nobody cares. It allows them to do things like, for people who've already consented, they can interpret the cookies and decide, okay, what third parties can be loaded. And if somebody's already consented and say they go away, come back in a few days later, we can use the fact they've already consented to inject pre-connects at the edge for our other third parties. The other place that might be interesting to explore where consent management should be is it should be built into the browser. Consent is about us. Browsers are our agents. Should they help manage consent on our behalf? But there's also some other challenges with consent. The FT run a service called polyfill.io. You give it a query string of which JavaScript features you're using, and depending on the browser, it will polyfill those features if it's missing. Part of the challenge is, though, it's a third party. My page probably isn't going to work without those polyfills, so we have a challenge. Do we go for legitimate interest argument, or do we do something else? And one of the things some people do to remove third parties is they proxy them using their CDN. Andrew Betts of Fastly wrote a blog post to save me going through it. I would have a read of this, and you can think about it as the CDN acts as a proxy for your third parties. So they become the same origin, so you get rid of some of the connection problems. The prioritization works for HTTP2, for example. But there are some challenges, because all of a sudden, those third parties are behaving as if they're part of your site. And you may be sending authorization cookies, which you don't want to send to those third parties. Your CDN may be adding X forwarded for, which with an IP address that you certainly don't want to send to those third parties. So we need to think about filtering those out if we go down that route. There are other still difficult choices. I asked a few people this question yesterday. If you're a big company, you can probably build your own server-side A/B testing network. Lots of other people rely on Maximizer and Optimizely, VWO, etc. And the question becomes, you can either load it render blocking, so it blocks the page, or you can use an anti-flicker snippet that hides the page. How am I supposed to make a decision on which is the best of those two? Pat Meenan actually suggested the anti-flicker snippet is the best because the browser can still work underneath. But it's not that simple, because what happens when consent fits into that picture? I can't load my blocking script until I've got consent, but the blocking script is stopping me from getting consent. Or I use an anti-flicker snippet that hides the page, so I can't show the consent dialog to get consent. I don't quite know the answer to this. Some of it might be self-hosting, as Casper did, where they self-hosted Optimizely script. Other options might be going server-side or to the edge. The beginning of a page load is the thorny bit. It's the hardest bit to sort out. It's one of the places I normally start when I'm looking at third parties. The other end of the spectrum is I work out what's in the middle of the waterfall that we really don't need till later. Is there any point in showing somebody a chat button until the page is loaded? Is there any point in using session replay to see what somebody's doing until they've got an experience in front of them? So I encourage customers and clients to move those until later and load them generally after on load. That does come with some challenges. To load a third party, we have the connection set up, we have to fetch the script, and it might create a long task. So if we move that to after onload, sometimes onload comes forward, often it does, but we've created a later long task. So does our TTI get worse? We can cheat, and because nobody says we've got to pre-connect just at the start of the page, we can use our tag manager to inject some pre-connects to that late loading third party halfway through the page. And generally, even in this situation, in the clients I've tried it with, the improvement from moving the third party later has outweighed the cost. So load has moved forward long enough so the late task isn't late. But we can cheat and add connection setup too. Your tag manager can help you do this. Tag managers have a really bad reputation. They have a reputation as something that anybody can take some content, throw it on the page, and you have no control. But they can also help us schedule when to load things. They also make it easy to take off poorly performing things. After the third parties that are on the page that we've scheduled based on what needs to be loaded early, what we can defer till later, we also have what can we load on demand. What doesn't need to be loaded until the visitor interacts with the page. There are classic things like the Calibre team built a facade for Intercom, I believe it was, for Intercom chat widget that just loads the chat button until somebody clicks on it, and then the rest of Intercom loads. Now, to me, Intercom should do that by default. Should load what we need to give a minimum viable experience to somebody, and then load it when they interact, or perhaps use a prefetch hint to load the bundle so it's there. Paul Irish wrote a web component for YouTube to do this. Quite why YouTube won't do it themselves, I have no idea. This is good, but it has some challenges. There's another way to lazy load YouTube. It works fine on desktop, but on mobile it needs some double clicks. There are also things you can do with reCAPTCHA. reCAPTCHA's horrible. It's a big JavaScript. And then, although it gets slotted into a worker, it's still a lot to download. Antonio wrote about how you can lazy load it. The reCAPTCHA team don't recommend doing this, but it's worth exploring to see whether it works. The other thing I do is set up your tag manager to inject reCAPTCHA, but only inject it onto the pages where you've actually got form fields. So minimizing the amount of third parties our poor visitors have to cope with. I've sort of talked about the beginning. I've talked about the end of page load. I've talked when people can interact. And I've sort of left off this messy middle where I'm a bit fuzzy, to be honest, on some of the things we should do here. Some of the things I try to get customers to think about is, does the tag provide content for the visitor to see? Is it a button that appears below the price that says they can pay with PayPal? In which case, should the script just go at that point in the document? One of the things with analytics is the later we load analytics, the more data we lose, because some people abandon the page or move on before the analytics beacons fire. And one of the key things is just at this point, try not to put render blocking stuff in, but sometimes we have no choices. Moving analytics server-side with something like Telium or server-side GTM can also help here, because we end up sending one data beacon to the server, and it fans it out to multiple services behind it. And what I sometimes end up doing is actually mapping this out for clients. And this is from a newspaper I worked with early last year, with all the challenges that newspapers have. And I got them to think about what was the most important things they needed to load from a content point of view and a commercial point of view, because ads matter in this situation, and got them to think about prioritizing it. And then we split it up into these buckets of what was the core content, consent management, because we need that, what were their primary partners, their secondary partners, secondary content that nobody really cared about, and some stuff that was left over that had to be loaded. And we mapped their third parties into these buckets. So we had the newspaper content. They used AMP as a framework rather than AMP as a CDN. Quantcast was their consent manager, and then we have things like GPT and pre-bid. If you ever wonder why people put mind-rotting stuff like Taboola or Outbrain on their news sites, it's because they pay per page view, so it's guaranteed income. And just got them to think about how their existing content fitted into these buckets, and we helped them to improve performance overall. So I'm really keen on the idea of controlling when third parties load and fitting them into the user journey or the user experience. And based on the work I've done with clients over the last 3 years since I started adopting this approach, it seems to work. The other thing to think about, and this is probably a more recent thing to think about, is where should the tag be executed? Traditionally, we've executed tags on the main thread. We've had other options for a while. Server-side tagging and server-side tag manager has been around for a while, but GTM is the most popular tag manager. And you can either host it on GCP or they have a Docker container. So you can host it yourself. Lives behind your firewall. If you do host it yourself, don't forget to put it behind your CDN. Don't forget to sit on gzip and H2 and all those things we would do on our normal site, because believe me, people do this, or they run their own containers and they forget to do this. But perhaps another place we could think about running tagging is at the edge. Run them in a Cloudflare worker or Fastly Compute at the edge, perhaps integrated with our CMP, so we can run them closer to our visitors, reducing the load on the main thread. Alex Joes of Google is currently looking at third-party performance, and he came up with this proposal for how we could standardize doing client-side A/B testing at the edge. So I think the edge offers lots of opportunities, and we've not explored them yet. The other place that offers lots of opportunities is running things off the main thread in the browser. People do this already. Content Square, who are our session replay, command, and performance analytics tool, use web workers to do things off the main thread. Recapture does things off the main thread. But Adam Bradley and some of the other folks at Builder.io came up with the idea of being able to execute GTM and GA and Mixpanel and others off the main thread. I played with it. It's impressive. The challenge I have is all the tags become non-standard. And the biggest thing I find is people get really nervous about doing non-standard things. When your tag manager says, you should implement it like this, and somebody's got this slightly weird variation, they get really nervous. So I don't know whether Party Town will be a success or not, but I really hope some of its ideas feed into other third parties. So all of a sudden, we get this multitude of options to consider when it comes to third parties. You know, when should we load them? And where should we execute them? I only drew this chart last week, so I'm actually still thinking about this. But I think there's some interesting things to think about. But you know, if we're going to improve our third-party performance, before we start working on it, we sort of need to think about how we're going to judge its success. How are we going to measure it? This is SpeedCurve with one of our charts on our third-party dashboards, and it shows the long tasks split amongst the third parties on the page. In the case here, Google Tag Manager is the worst. There's Content Square, there's Qubit, Hotjar, and Google Analytics, all running long tasks. And so that gives us some hints about if we want to improve, where we might want to focus our efforts. I'd encourage you to measure with and without consent. We get lots of people who start off as default by measuring without consent, and that's a different experience to what people using the site get. The numbers on the left are the first-party requests and size in orangey color. The ones in the blue are the third-party ones. And we can see, even on Halfords, which is a UK automotive cycling site, they have some third parties loading without consent. They'll be their consent manager. They use Typekit for fonts. They use Ampliance for images. But we can begin to see how much larger the page gets with the third parties. The other thing to consider is load without third parties as well. Block it, track its performance, because that gives you the baseline of what you're actually building before you add those third parties. You can look at the gap between them. The gap between them will tell you what the cost of your third parties in. Not all third parties are whatever our provider chooses to give us. For some third parties, we actually control their content. We control what goes in our tag manager. We control what gets sent as part of testing tools, how many variants of a test we're running, whether we're shipping production and pre-production tests to all our visitors, as I've seen somewhere. And I think it'd be really handy to start to track when those things that are being managed by other teams change. The only challenge is GTM only supports email notifications when the container changes, and most of us like webhooks. Whether we want it sent to Slack or SpeedCurve or another product, we want a webhook. Simon Williamson, who founded Eventbrite, talks a lot about Git scraping. And I was thinking about this problem, and I thought, I can fix this as a GitHub action. I can check out a repo, I can fetch a set of GTM containers, I can reformat them, extract the version out of them. If the version's changed since last time, I can send a notification to SpeedCurve, and I can check it back in. So we have a way of tracking when the container changes, when its version changes. This works for GTM because the URL is consistent. I tried looking at this for some A/B testing tools, and they serve a JSON response that's hashed, so the URL changes. So it might not work anywhere, or everywhere, sorry. But if you want to go play with it, it's on GitHub. You can pick it up and go poke holes in my code and fix it when it breaks, and then send me some pull requests. The other thing to think about when we're monitoring third parties is, what are we actually measuring? Are we measuring their number of requests and their weight, or the byte size, or when they load, or are we measuring their impact on our visitors' experience? And I'm really keen, Tammy and Cliff will tell you this, I'm really keen about measuring impact on visitors' experience. I love user timing, I love element timing, because we can do things like use mutation observers on the DOM to discover how long our A/B test anti-flicker snippet hit the page from our visitor. We can use things like the events that the IAB EU's consent platform. They fire events when things happen. They fire events when they show the UI. They fire events when the visitor accepts or rejects cookies. They fire events on follow-up visits when the consent manager is loaded and is ready to tell other third parties what they can do. So we can use user timing. We can track those events, detect when they happen, use user timing to tell us in the wild how long our visitors are waiting to see that UI and how long they are having to wait before the third parties get permission to load. GTM has some events that we can follow too. Things like when was an ad slot shown? When did the creative in it load? It won't be completely accurate. They may not match the visual experience. But as long as it's consistent, if we're making performance improvements, then we get the ability to track. If we're measuring a consistent point, if we make improvements, then that point should move better. Google Publisher Tag did have some timing marks of its own that we've got some customers following. And unfortunately, they pulled them out at the end of August, which was a bit sad. There's some examples of these snippets in this GitHub repo if you want them. There's no guarantees on them. I've tested them. They work. I have some people running them, but there may be some flaws in them. But there are gaps. There are gaps in what we can measure. There are still limits on whether we can attribute long tasks in JavaScript to third parties in the wild, to which third party was responsible for it. And Yoav's working on some of that. Some of these third parties are loaded in iframes. And Ian Clallan's working on the idea of extending the performance timeline so iframes can bubble up some of their performance events. So we could get to a world in which, say, our advertising provider used element timing to tell us when an ad was rendered, and it was bubbled up so we could pick it up at the top. I hold hope of being able to bubble events across iframes. I hold less hope of advertising providers actually telling us when their ads render. So we've talked about sequencing, we've talked about where to run them, and we've talked about measuring them and some of the gaps. And I'd like to return to our main thread puzzle from earlier in the talk. And this is from an actual client who employed me to look at their main thread. As a bit of background, they just replatformed. It was a very important project from a political point of view within the organization, and they replatformed to Next.js. Their Lighthouse score tanked. And as normal in these sorts of situations, you get people pointing fingers at each other. It's their fault. No, it's their fault. And we can see at the start here that, yes, Next.js does come with some costs. But we can also see over here that we were able to remove some of the third-party long tasks. And the way I approach this is I use DevTools, WebKit Inspector, Firefox's DevTools, to profile the page. This is a GTM long task, to see where those long tasks are coming from. One of the things I would like you to remember is at the bottom of the That's a flame chart, isn't it? At the bottom of the stalagmites, you'll see DOM operations. You'll see insert before. You'll see set inner HTML. You might see append child. Just remember that for later. The other thing to do with this, when you're trying to debug them, is read the source. You discover interesting things, like this code, which I tweeted about. And Annie Sullivan was kind enough to respond saying, that looks like a test for IE6, because IE6 used a graph for the DOM instead of a tree. And if you had badly nested elements, it caused problems. Elliot Spren said, that's Crux PostScript. And Crux PostScript is a JavaScript library that allows us to do document write even on async loaded scripts. There was a time in the past where if you actually did document write in an async script, you'd crash the browser because there's no what's known as a detached document in web terms. So this was interesting. I can't remember who, but somebody sent it to Shubi Panika, who sent it to Adi Osmani, and Adi Osmani went to talk to the GTM team and came back to me and said, it's included only if this box is checked. And that box only needs to be checked if the tag uses document.write. And this is custom HTML. It's not needed if the tag is doing something like document open, document write, document close, just if it's using document write. So that was interesting. I thought, right, let's go search GTM source code for which tags are using this, via this nifty little regular expression. And we'll go find some of them. And here's the first one. And this is a double-click pixel that uses document.write to write an image pixel in with a random string on the end. I could rewrite this in straightforward DOM operations that didn't use document.write. Go looking for some more, and we found this one, and this, or ones like this, and this is pretty common, where somebody just checked document.write by accident or unintentionally. And so what we were able to do is go remove all these incorrectly tags that were marked as using document.write. Rocky Nibwani, who's here, was at George Clothing at the time, and he'd been following along on Twitter, and he decided to go and check all the same things on George Clothing. And they had a bunch of tags that were marked as using document.write and didn't need it. Difference was they already started with a pretty small GTM container, but they stripped out 4K from the container. And all their long task times reduced as well. So that's one way we got some wins. When you get some wins in web performance, you sort of start pulling at that thread and you follow it and you see where it's going. So I went looking for what other things I could find in GTM. And if you remember from the earlier flame chart, we could see where GTM was adding stuff to the document. So I started adding log points for the DOM operations. In this example, I'm only adding them for insert before, which is what GTM uses to include scripts. And there are 6, but the video doesn't show them all. So we find them and add them. And then we hit reload. Page reloads. And in our console, we get a list of all the tags that GTM added to our page. Up the top, we can see normal scripts. Partway down, we can see some of the inline scripts that were added. And then, weirdly, we get some text elements. And these text elements just add a new line. So we've got these tags that are doing all this work in GTM to add a new line to our page. Never really got completely to the bottom of why this happened, but it gave us some other things that we discovered along the way. We discovered that if you enabled Google Optimize, which this company had done 2 years previously, but they didn't use it, second version of GA got added. We found that setting up a taxonomy of GA custom dimensions in GTM was really expensive when it came to running, and so we got rid of the ones they didn't use. We found some other miscellaneous cleanups that we could do. And I suspect we just scratched the surface, but I made enough improvements, or I helped them make enough improvements in their third party that another team could then go focus on their first party. And that's how we got from the situation of having lots of third-party long tasks to less third-party long tasks. This one at the end is actually a GPT that's in a different iframe. So we can go beyond sequencing. We can dig into our third parties and begin to understand their performance. And I think the recommendations I made to you is, we all know third parties can be really good or really awful for user experience. The way I approach the problem is go make friends with who runs your tags. And be their friend. Help them to improve. Show them how they can improve. Audit the tags. This should be done anyway for legal compliance. But audit the tags. Get rid of the ones you don't need. Don't accept the defaults. Don't accept a tag manager that wants to load everything as soon as it loads. Think about when you should load those third parties and how they fit into your visitor experience. Push the boundaries. Think about how you can go beyond the main thread. Think about the edge. Think about workers. Think about going server-side. Chase third parties to fix their issues. Oh, God. So I have mixed success with this. During the example I gave you, we found some problems with some of the third parties. People like Content Square were really good. They fixed it in 7 days, I think. There were some other third parties that fixed problems, but there are others that, quite frankly, just don't seem to give a toss. FIFO is a reviews service in the UK, and some of my friends know I hate reviews services. While working with another client, we found the fact they inject 0.5 megabyte of CSS into the page. In that 0.5 megabyte of CSS are base 64 encoded fonts. Now, there's not one variant of each font, or one format of each font. They inject both TTF and WAF and WAF2 versions. And the reality is, it doesn't matter. The browser's only going to pick one of them. So inject WAF. But that's costing them money with Akamai. But we could never get them to pay attention and fix it. And I've got other stories like that. It's sad. They could save themselves money. They could deliver better experiences. Share what you learn. We get better at this because we share with each other. And some other people who shared stuff with each other or with us is Barry Pollard, who now works at Google, wrote about controlling Google Tag Manager. He worked for a healthcare provider, the most sensitive of personal information. So he produced a really locked down tag version for them. Gareth Clubb at the FT, the Telegraph, long day. Gareth at the Telegraph wrote about how they managed their tags. And I don't quite subscribe to that approach, but it worked for them. Because we can help people to keep their tags. This is an example I did with Cloudflare Workers and OPI, the Nail Varnish site. They don't have the greatest time to first byte, which is why the film strip starts late. But in the bottom one, I used the Cloudflare Worker to sequence their tags and delay the ones that don't matter. And we get a second improvement in FCP. Taming tags can also deliver financial benefits. A few years ago, 5 years ago now, I did a case study with a client at the time who sold women's wear fashion. We noticed that Bizarre Voice, another unpopular review service with me, was really slow on Android. They were brave. They removed Bizarre Voice for Android. So we had this perfect A/B test of with and without it. And they got a 26% increase from Android visitors. You'll notice this is on load because this is what it's this way, isn't it? On load because that's what we had at the time. I'd be really interested to see what it did to INP today. But that 26% increase was worth between 1% and 2% of their revenue, and they turned over £250 million a year. So that is a significant amount of revenue they got from sorting out their third parties. Thank you for listening. I hope that was useful. I'm over there in the next break. So if you've got any questions after I've talked to Henri, we can go there. If you've got any other questions afterwards, you can find me on Twitter or at SpeedCurve. And an early version of my slides are here, but they need a few fixes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Andy. And as usual, a very detailed talk, full of fantastic examples and data. I miss seeing your slides. You have this particular style I like where everything's readable because you put in like that background for the contrast and stuff.
Yeah, I just did it one day and it worked for me and I stuck with it ever since.
Yeah, I'm not mad. By the way, we're talking about authors and whatnot earlier. You know, somehow I skipped Tammy Everts, who's also with us, who's also an author, and who spoke yesterday? I can't remember. Yeah, yesterday. I mean, it's been a long day as well, so pardon me. We have 1 million questions. You know, do you want?
Surprise me.
You know, do you want 1,000,001 of them, or you let me know? I'm going to start with this one right here, and okay. What happens if your consent manager is a third party?
So
let me finish. Does that risk sharing IP before consent is granted?
yes, that's one of the real challenges. Is consent managers are often third parties. How do we cope with that trade-off of sharing personal data with somebody else to get consent? I think the only way you can argue it is it's a legitimate interest. It's something you have to do. But it wouldn't surprise me if a lawyer, in particular Maximilian Schrems, who's taking a lot of these GDPR cases across Europe to various data protection authorities, argues the case that actually you should create your own consent manager. But we will see. He may argue it may not be legitimate interest. It's about risk and it's about legal opinions, and it depends, to borrow some of my friends' phrases.
I mean, perf now sounds like it's just it depends now. By the way, we mentioned again authors. I know one of the blog posts was written by Andrew Betts, who's also in the building, wherever he's at. Shout outs. Also mentioned was Paul Irish, who's in the building. Shout outs. I see you. Let's go with some other questions here. Any thoughts, insights about using PartyTown to run third-party code inside a web worker to reduce main thread blocking?
Yes. Great, now you're going to ask me what they are. I think PartyTown is a really interesting experiment. The sites I've seen it implemented on have relatively simple third-party arrangements. They have a tag manager, they have some analytics. And it's good at coping with those use cases. Mm-hmm. And they tend to be technical people who've implemented it. I think the challenge becomes is, will it go to a wider audience where we have what we might describe as slightly less technical people implementing tags? And I've not seen anybody try it yet, although somebody promised to try it yesterday, so we might have a case study on a bigger site sooner or later. Oh,
okay. I thought you were going to tell me you were going to have answers by end of day.
No.
You know, because this is performance now, right? Andy, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
If we have any other questions, because we definitely did, should people just tweet you?
Oh, I'm in there in the next break. So
okay.
Come and see me.
All right. In real life, folks, in person. Come and see Andy in there. And again, Andy, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.